everyone. I'm Paul Perry, Director of Education here at the National Museum of the United States Navy, and welcome to this book talk with Mark Steele. The book is Leyte Gulf 1944 Part 1, The Battles of the Sibuyan Sea and Samar Campaign, Osprey Publishing, November 2021. Leyte Gulf, which is located in the Philippine Sea, is considered to have been the largest naval battle of World War II and, by some criteria, possibly the largest naval battle in history, with over 200,000 U.S. naval personnel involved. Mark Steele is a retired U.S. Navy commander and is both an author and historian. He completed a career as a naval intelligence officer in 2001, having served on the Joint Staff, the faculty of the Naval War College, several other operational tours, and as a member of the ship's companies of carriers Nimitz and Carl Vinson. After leaving the Navy, he conducted a career in the intelligence community for another 18 years. Almost all of this time was spent at the Defense Intelligence Agency and was focused on China. As a matter of fact, he eventually became the agency's senior intelligence officer on China. As a historian, his primary focus has been on naval operations and warfare, with a focus on the Pacific War. To date, he has over 54 books published, his latest works, including the one he'll be talking about today, Pacific Carrier War. After leaving the Navy, he continued a career in the intelligence community for another 18 years. Almost all of this time was spent at the Defense Intelligence Agency and was focused on China. As a matter of fact, he eventually became the agency's senior intelligence officer on China. As a historian, his primary focus has been on naval operations and warfare, with a focus on the Pacific War. To date, he has over 54 books published, his latest works including the one he'll talk about today, Pacific Carrier War, the United States Navy in World War II, and USN Submarine versus IJN Anti-Submarine Escort, IJN standing for Imperial Japanese Navy. Mark currently resides with his wife and son in Annapolis, Maryland. Just to remind everyone to please type any comments or questions you have in the comments block beneath the video feed. With that, let's get right to it. Mark, welcome to the program.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. We're going to talk about Leyte Gulf today. It's a very large battle, as no doubt you all know. So we can't talk about all four of the major battles in our 45 minutes or so that we have. So we're going to talk about two of those battles, the battles of the Sibuyan Sea and the Battle off Samar. Okay, here's the outline of what we're going to cover today in our allotted time. We're going to talk about the principal command figures in the battle. We're going to take a quick look at the opposing forces that fought the battle. We're going to spend some more time on the plans because it's important to understand the plans, and in particular the Japanese plan, to understand why the battle turned out the way it did. Then we'll look at the two battles that we just mentioned. And finally, we're going to wrap up with some pithy analysis of those two battles. Okay, looking at the principal U.S. Navy commanders in the battle, it's important to know that though they were all U.S. Navy commanders that oversaw the various forces in the battle, they were subordinate to two different theaters. And that would prove to be a problem, as we'll see later on in this talk. So Admiral Chester Nimitz is the commander of the Pacific Ocean area and the Pacific Fleet. He's fairly well known as and well respected as a leader and a strategist, and he was well regarded by his subordinates because he did not meddle much in their affairs. He let them get on with the tasks that they had been given by him. But it's important to know, too, that he did oversee major operations, and he did send his commanders recommendations during the course of the battle, and that's what happened at Leyte. Under Chester Nimitz is William Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet. He's probably the best known American naval commander of the war, known as a very aggressive commander, called bold by most and even rash by others. He was all those things, I think, during the Leyte Gulf battle. He did not take advice well from his subordinates. And his principal subordinate was Mark Mitcher, who was commander of Task Force 38. He was the most experienced carrier commander in the world at this point, but he did have a fractious relationship with Halsey, because Halsey wanted to be both fleet commander, and at times he took over tactical control of Task Force 38 as well. So Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid was commander of 7th Fleet. 7th Fleet was not subordinate to Nimitz. It was subordinate to MacArthur in his capacity as Southwest Pacific Area Commander. So that's a very important aspect of the battle, which we'll talk about later. Kincaid was a solid commander. He was able to work well with the Army and even with the prickly MacArthur. But he gets a pass here on some of the problems that we'll see later on in the battle. Clifton Sprague is also a commander of note during this battle. He was commander of Taffy 3. Taffy 3 is one of the subordinate units in Kincaid's 7th Fleet. He was also an experienced carrier commander, and he did a very good job during the battle, as we'll talk about later. There were a lot of Japanese naval commanders that played a role in these two battles that we're going to talk about, but we're only going to discuss two of them today. The first one is Admiral Toyota, who's the commander of the Combined Fleet. The Combined Fleet encompasses all of the ocean-going elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy, so it's the most important part of the IJN. He got the job as Combined Fleet Commander in May 1944, so he oversaw the Japanese defeat at Philippine Sea a month later, and then he came up with this plan to defend the Philippines, and which guided the battle fought in October that we'll talk about. The next Japanese commander, he's the most controversial Japanese commander of the battle. That was Vice Admiral Kurita, who was commander of what the Japanese called the First Diversion Attack Force. Kurita was a combat veteran. He saw a lot of action during the war. He was certainly no coward, even though some people accused him of being such later in the battle. This slide shows the opposing forces. It's an overview of the principal forces in the battle. In October 1944, on the left-hand side of the Japanese forces, it's important to note that this was an all-out effort by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Pretty much every major combatant, that's destroyer size and above, left the Japanese was used in the battle, trying to turn the tide of the war. You can see that this is an unbalanced force. The Japanese carrier force by this point in the war was very weak. There were only 4 carriers in the battle, and they only carried a relative handful of aircraft. So the Japanese hoped to make up the difference with a large land-based air force, but the problem was, though, that this was also weak. There were only about 260 operational aircraft in all of the Philippines when the battle began. But the Japanese were very strong, as you see on the slide here, with heavy ships, battleships, and heavy cruisers. That's where their strength was, and that was the ace card the Japanese were going to try to use in this battle. On the right-hand side is the American fleet, comprised of both the 3rd Fleet and the 7th Fleet. Many more times total combatants than the Japanese brought to bear in the battle. A very strong carrier force. 16 fleet and light carriers were arrayed in the battle and supported by 18 escort carriers, and they embarked a total of about 1,500 aircraft. So that's an overwhelmingly strong carrier air force. Also, though they brought a large surface combatant force to the fight, 12 battleships, 6 were old, 6 were new, and the other combatants as shown here. So overall, there was a marked imbalance in the battle in the favor of the USN. Going to look at Task Force 38 next. That played a very important part in the battle because it was the most important American naval force in the battle. In fact, it's not exaggeration to say that this was the most powerful naval force in the world at this point in the war. Broken down into 4 task groups, as was American doctrine at this point in the war. But there were some problems here because the strongest task group, 38.1, was not available until late on the 25th of October, so it missed the first part of the battle. There were 8 fleet carriers present. These were, all but one were Essex-class ships. These were very powerful ships. Each of these embarked about a 90 aircraft strong air group. Also, 8 light carriers were used in the battle. These were converted light cruisers, but they were still very handy ships, but they only carried about 34 aircraft each. It's important to also talk about the aircraft aboard these carriers because they were all very modern and quite capable aircraft. The standard fighter was the Hellcat, and that was much better than the Japanese fighter of the period. Principal dive bomber, well, at this point, the only dive bomber was the Helldiver, which had finally overcome its teething problems. It was a very rugged and reliable aircraft by this point in the war. And most importantly, the torpedo bomber, the Avenger, now had a reliable air-launched torpedo. So earlier in the war, the Americans had a lot of problems with the reliability of their air-launched torpedoes, and this was not the case by Leyte Gulf. Also present in Task Force 38 was a large surface force, as you see there. And Halsey intended to give them a prominent part in the battle. He wanted the surface ships to have the chance to mop up what the carrier aviators had damaged. So he did foresee a big role for the surface ships. And among them were 6 battleships. These were, at this point in the war, the best battleships in the world because primarily of their advanced fire control systems. So they carried the best fire control systems in the world and used these to employ their 16-inch naval rifles. Okay, the escort carrier group was not under Nimitz. It was part of the 7th Fleet, as we've already discussed. And this was broken down into 3 task units. And they were referred to by their call signs, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, Taffy 3. And Taffy 3 is going to play a prominent role in the battle, so we're going to look at that in more detail. This is the one commanded by Admiral Sprague, who performed very well in the battle off Samar. So he had 6 escort carriers available to him. These escort carriers were converted from merchant hulls, so they were very slow with a top speed of about 18 knots, and they were unarmed, lightly armed, and unarmored. But they did carry about 28 aircraft each, a mix of fighters and torpedo bombers. There were also 3 destroyers as escorts for Taffy 3. These were all modern ships. They were Fletcher-class destroyers. They each carried 10 torpedo tubes and 5 5-inch guns. And also a small number of destroyer escorts were present for duty with Taffy 3. Okay, turning now to the Japanese, we're going to look at the 1st Diversion Attack Force. This was the force under the command of Vice Admiral Kurita, and it was the centerpiece of the Japanese plan. So accordingly, the Japanese allocated it the strongest ships they had available, and the large force assigned to it included those shown here in the slide. The 5 battleships included the 2 Yamato-class battleships, which were the biggest battleships ever built, with 18.1-inch guns, which were the largest naval guns ever put on a ship. And they were extremely well protected, as we'll see was true later in the battle. Also 10 heavy cruisers. These were also excellent platforms because they had proven themselves to be formidable opponents earlier in the battle. They were fast and rugged. Most of these ships carried 10 8-inch guns and a heavy torpedo battery. And there also were 2 destroyer squadrons there as well as escorts. This force was very powerful, but there were some problems with it. The foremost problems being the weakness in anti-aircraft protection. The Japanese were not able to allocate any air cover for the 1st Diversion Attack Force. So that meant that the Japanese had to defend themselves with only anti-aircraft guns. And though they greatly reinforced the anti-aircraft fit of these ships throughout the war. They were equipped with mediocre weapons with even more mediocre fire control systems. So the bottom line was that Japanese surface ships were vulnerable to air attack. There was a problem with fuel too. This is because by this point in the war, the Japanese had lost the ability to conduct underway replenishment with their entire fleet. So fuel was a big problem. It was on the mind of Kurita throughout the battle, as we'll talk about more. Now we're going to look at the plans that both sides used during the battle. The Americans chose Leyte as the first point to invade in the Philippines for a number of reasons, but primarily because it was easy access from the Philippine Sea. So MacArthur's 6th Army was going to land on Leyte with 4 divisions. They would build airfields on the island and then proceed to advance into the central Philippines and eventually onto the main island of Luzon in the Philippines. The 7th Fleet was tasked to deliver the invasion force and provide protection against local threats like submarines and air attack. But the 3rd Fleet, being the most powerful U.S. naval force in the operation, was tasked to provide strategic support against major Japanese naval and air operations should they decide to try to threaten the invasion. But there were some problems with this with the American plan, because we've already touched on one of those. One was the divided command structure. So the 3rd and the 7th Fleet did not answer to the same commander. So this divided command structure was going to cause problems later in the battle. In fact, there weren't even methods of direct communications between Halsey and Kinkaid. And also Halsey was forced into an unenviable situation because he had competing priorities. His main mission was to provide support to the landing, but then Nimitz gave him other orders before the operation that should the Japanese fleet try to intervene, then in that case, your main task is to destroy the Japanese fleet. So this caused confusion later in the battle. Okay, now turning to the Japanese plan, we'll look at that in a bit more detail since it was so critical to how the battle turned out. The Japanese believed, certainly Toyota believed, that defense of the Philippines was critical. And the reason is because the Philippines sit astride the sea lines of communication between Japan and the resource areas in Southeast Asia. So if you lose control of the Philippines, those sea lanes are cut and Japan faces economic strangulation. Also in the mind of Toyota was a desire to prompt another decisive battle with the USN. The concept of a decisive battle was in the DNA of the Imperial Navy. They had tried it several times before during the war, did not work, but this was their last chance to fight and win a decisive battle, which might swing the course of the war. So the centerpiece of this plan was the 1st Diversion Attack Force. And the plan basically revolved around getting the 1st Diversion Attack Force into Leyte Gulf to attack the invasion fleet. So you attack the invasion fleet, you crush the invasion, and you force the Americans back. However, as we've already seen, the Japanese were very weak in air power, so they had the problem of devising a method to get the 1st Diversion Attack Force into Leyte Gulf in the face of overwhelming American air superiority. And they came up with 2 ways how they might negate this problem they had with lack of naval air power. The first was they were going to try to cripple Task Force 38 with land-based air attacks, and that didn't work. They had another ace up their sleeve. They were prepared to use what was left of their carrier force to lure Halsey to the north so Kurita's force could slip in behind it and get into Leyte Gulf. This problem was flawed for a number of reasons. We could go on for quite a while what they were, but here are the big ones here on the slide. The biggest one is their forces were simply inadequate, as we've already seen, and they were very weak in air power. It's a very complex plan. There were forces coming from different directions over a great distance, so they had to have excellent timing and coordination, and that was not possible, and it did not occur during this battle. The biggest problem, though, was that for a number of reasons, fuel being the biggest one, that it would be impossible for the main attack force, that is the first diversion attack force, to arrive off Leyte and attack the invasion force until 5 days after the invasion. So we'll see if that's good enough. The plan is called Show 1, show meaning victory. And there were several variants of the show plan, and Show 1 was the variant for defense of the Philippines. But the bottom line is Show 1 had little chance of success. This slide gives an overview of the Show 1 plan. The force of principal concern to us is the force shown in the solid red line. That's the first diversion attack force coming out of Singapore, going up to the Palawan Passage, then transiting the Sibuyan Sea, and advancing through San Bernardino Strait out into the Philippine Sea, and then down south into Leyte Gulf. Supporting this was another force that branched off from the first diversion attack force, which left Brunei and on Borneo after Krita did, and that force was tasked to proceed directly to Leyte Gulf through the Sulu Sea and into Leyte Gulf from Surigao Strait in the south. And that's the force that fought the Battle of Surigao Strait with Kincaid's 7th Fleet. Another force of interest is the one to the north there, that dotted line to the north, leaving Japanese home waters and transiting into the Philippine Sea. That's the carrier force that was tasked to lure Halsey away from San Bernardino Strait so Kurita could make his way into Leyte Gulf. So the battle didn't really begin when the Americans landed on Leyte on 20 October. The battle began more than a week earlier when Task Force 38 was rampaging through the Western Pacific, trying to neutralize Japanese air power in the region before the invasion. So the American carrier force attacked Okinawa, then it moved on to attack Formosa. You can see there pounded Formosa with a huge number of sorties between 12 and 14 October. But this gave Toyota the chance he had been seeking to cripple Task Force 38 with the application of land-based air power, which he tried to do. He assembled a huge force to do this, but they were not able to mount massed air attacks on Task Force 38. The American Hellcats, which were radar guided, fighter direction by radar, was very effective, and they made short work of almost all the Japanese air raids, inflicting very heavy losses on the Japanese land-based air forces, at least over 500 aircraft, though the figures differ there. They did have some marginal success. They were able to torpedo 2 U.S. Navy cruisers. Both of these ships survived, though, but they were not able to damage, at least severely, and put out of action any of the U.S. carriers. So the bottom lines of the air battle off Formosa is that in the days before the decisive battle that the Japanese hoped to fight, their land-based air force was crippled. So if the Show 1 plan had very little hope of success before this battle, it had zero chance of success after the results of the air battle off Formosa. Okay, so the first diversion attack force is the central character in this story, so we're going to follow their movements here in some detail. It was apparent the Japanese did expect the Americans to attack Leyte at about the time they did, but they had to be sure of this because they didn't have the fuel for a false start. So when it looked like Leyte was under threat, Kurita departed the Singapore area and steamed over to Brunei for refueling. At that point, it was crystal clear that Leyte was the point of the invasion. So on 22 October, Kurita leaves Brunei and heads off towards Leyte Gulf. But note, though, this is already 2 days after the invasion. And the earliest he can get there into Leyte Gulf to attack the invasion fleet is going to be 25 October. He takes the most direct route through the Palawan Passage. And again, this is because he has a schedule to maintain. He's got to get there by 25 October. It's also, again, due to fuel. So he heads through Palawan Passage. He does not bother to send an ASW picket in advance of his force. He's ambushed by 2 U.S. Navy submarines in the morning of the 23rd of October, and they conduct a brilliant attack, and they torpedo and sink 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, and a third one is torpedoed and heavily damaged and forced to return to Singapore. One of the 2 ships lost was Kurita's flagship. So he starts the battle off by taking a swim. He's fished out of the water, and then he's embarked on a battleship. But the battle starts off poorly for the 1st Diversion Attack Force. 24th of October is a key date because this is when the 1st Diversion Attack Force gets within range of Task Force 38. So to allow the large surface fleet to proceed to Leyte Gulf, the Japanese have to neutralize the American carrier fleet. They try this once again with some large-scale air attacks on the 24th of October. They're only able to discover and detect one of the task groups of Task Force 38. That's Task Group 38.3 operating to the east of Luzon, and they send everything they have against it. They do have some success, though the Hellcats once again make short work of most of these raids. One Japanese dive bomber does get through and conducts a skillful attack on carrier Princeton. The ship is set on fire and later sinks. Actually, she was scuttled. But the Japanese do have some success on the 24th of October. But obviously, the loss of one light carrier does not cripple Task Force 38. So this leaves Kurita totally exposed. The Japanese chose to conduct offensive strikes with their available aircraft on the 24th and not to provide air cover to Kurita. So Kurita is going to face an overwhelming level of air attack on the 24th. These attacks are known as the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. They occurred throughout the morning and into the afternoon. They did take a heavy toll on the Japanese. But what's overlooked here is that Task Force 38 really didn't perform that well on the 24th of October, and that's due to Halsey. Task Force 38 was not well deployed to take on the Japanese. And this is because Halsey and every other major American naval commander present in the battle did not expect a major Japanese attempt to attack the invasion force. So he was not ready. He was caught off guard by this major Japanese effort. And that meant that only one of the task groups was in an immediate position to strike Kurita's force. And this is 38.2. And 38.2 is the weakest of the 4 task groups present, with only 1 fleet carrier and 1 light carrier. There's a second light carrier, but it was the night flying carrier, so it wasn't used to attack Kurita during the day. So this is the force that conducts 3 of the 5 strikes during the day. So these 5 strikes are mounted starting at about 10:30. They go to about 1600 in the afternoon. The first 2 strikes were from 38.2, and they focus on the battleship Musashi. She was a large target. She was chosen because of that. And once she was damaged, she was the focus for all the subsequent, not all, but the majority of the subsequent attacks focused on Musashi. The first 2 raids from 38.2 put 4 torpedoes into Musashi. brought her speed down to 22 knots, but she was still able to proceed with Kurita's force. The third raid shows up from Task Group 38.3, and they put 3 more torpedoes into Musashi, and at this point her speed was reduced to 12 knots, though she was not in danger of sinking. But she wasn't going to be able to keep up with the rest of the force, obviously. The next raid was mounted from Task Group 38.4. This finished off Musashi. Musashi at this point was unmaneuverable with only 12 knots speed. 4 more torpedoes hit the ship, 10 bombs, and this did finish her off because she sank later in the evening. But she absorbed a total of at least 11 and probably as many as 15 torpedoes, as well as 16 bombs. So while the Americans were focusing on Musashi, the rest of the 1st Diversion Attack Force was not heavily damaged. So the results overall of the American attacks on the 24th is disappointing. Over 250 sorties were mounted, and as we said, they did score major success in sinking Musashi, but other than that, they only forced one other ship out of the battle. That was a heavy cruiser that was torpedoed and forced to proceed back to Singapore. Other than that, there were several ships damaged, but they were able to continue with Kurita's force, and they maintained their full fighting effectiveness. The Japanese were unable to contend with these air attacks. Only 18 American aircraft were lost throughout the day. Another factor that must be mentioned is that the American aviators overclaimed the damage that they did to Kurita's force. They claimed much more damage than they in fact did. So the impression that Halsey got at the conclusion of these attacks was that Kurita's force had been badly battered. And this impression that Halsey had was highlighted by the fact that late during these attacks, Kurita actually ordered a retreat to the west. So in Kurita's mind, he's facing unrelenting air attack with no end in sight. He does not know that the Japanese carrier force has lured away Halsey successfully. He does not know the outcome of the land-based air attacks on Task Force 38, but he cannot take this kind of pounding. So at 15:30, he heads to the west to gain some relief. But as we've seen at about 1600, 1550, thereabouts, the last attack was mounted. So with no more attacks in the offing, Kurita heads back towards the east, back towards San Bernardino Strait at 1714 hours. And there's some mythology in the battle that he only did this when he was given orders to do so by Toyota. But these orders did not arrive on Kurita's flagship until after 1900 hours. So that was well after Kurita had already turned back to the east. So he's heading towards San Bernardino Strait, and the first of the 2 controversial decisions in the battle was Halsey's decision on the 24th, late on the 24th, to head north to take on the Japanese carrier force. So we can't get into the why he did this in detail. We'll do it next time, I hope. But the bottom line is that when Kurita reaches San Bernardino Strait, he is able to go through unopposed. So he enters the Philippine Sea and he heads south to Leyte Gulf, and he tells his boss that he'll be there at 1100 hours. So as Kurita is heading south, he thinks there's nothing in the way to impede his progress straight into the Gulf. But in fact, there are some elements of the 7th Fleet operating to the east of Samar and also to the east of Leyte. And these are the 3 Taffies. Taffy 3 is the one to the north, so that's the one that contacts the Japanese. So just before 0700 hours, the 2 sides are totally surprised when they spot each other. The Americans, of course, don't expect any Japanese force to be in the area, and the Japanese do not expect anything else blocking their path to Leyte Gulf. Both sides are very surprised, and the Japanese, though, really never regain their balance. They never correctly identify what they were facing. They were facing 6 escort carriers, but in their mind, what they saw was an element of the Third Fleet. They were facing fleet carriers. They were facing heavy cruisers. In fact, at some point in the battle, they also saw a battleship, they thought. So in their mind, they're facing a frontline naval force, part of the Third Fleet. So this prompts Kurita's very confused response. He orders a general attack, a so-called general attack, which means that it's a charge, really, instead of a coordinated assault by his fleet. Sprague, though, acts very decisively and quickly sizes up where he's at. He knows he can't contend with this force, which his flyers have correctly identified as being composed of 4 battleships and other heavy ships. He heads to the west at his best speed, he heads to the east at his best speed, trying to open up the range with the Japanese. He lays heavy smoke throughout the battle. And this is effective because the Japanese don't have radar-guided gunnery. They really have to see their target to hit it accurately. And they only see the escort carriers for certain periods during the battle. And Sprague also orders that all his aircraft get off the decks right away and begin a relentless series of attacks on the Japanese. In fact, they're able to launch almost 100 aircraft in the first few minutes of the battle from the flight decks of Taffy 3. So the Americans are not helpless in this battle. So the mythology that this is so one-sided and the escort carrier force should have been destroyed in 15 minutes, that misses the point, because there are a huge number of American aircraft on the Taffys. There's almost 500 aircraft in total, and these are used effectively during the battle. Like we just mentioned, Taffy 3 launches 100 aircraft right away. These start to harass the Japanese during the first minutes of the battle. Taffy 2 to the south launches over 200 aircraft during the course of the battle. And in total, throughout the day, there are 441 sorties from the escort carriers directed against the Japanese. And while it may be true that the escort carrier pilots were not well trained to attack maritime targets, they were trained to attack maritime targets, and they were equipped with torpedoes. So, in fact, Kurita, after the battle, he said that of all the air attacks he experienced during these 3 days, and he's the expert at evaluating American air attacks, that the best ones were those made by the Taffy 3 aviators during the Battle off Samar. So this is not a one-sided action by any means. Sprague orders an attack by his destroyers early in the battle, trying to buy more time. His chance of success here is to buy more time and wait for help to arrive. And there is help. There's Taffy 2 to the south, and also there are the heavy ships of Kincaid's 7th Fleet that just annihilated the Japanese at Sargas Strait. They're about 100 miles to the southwest. So Sprague's trying to buy time. He orders his destroyers to conduct a torpedo attack. Early in the battle, they're successful at this. Johnston torpedoes one of the Japanese heavy cruisers. It's out of the battle. A second heavy cruiser goes to assist it. It's also out of the battle. So right at the bat, there are 2 of these heavy cruisers out of the fight. Americans do pay a price, though. Destroyer hull is crippled pretty early in the battle, and Johnston is damaged. At 7:42, Sprague orders another torpedo attack to relieve the pressure, and this time the remaining destroyers go into action, also supported by the destroyer escorts. This shows how the formations were arrayed at the start of the battle, just before 0700. You can see Kurita's force to the left, and the lead elements of the force were those 4 heavy cruisers you can see on the right-hand side of his formation. And they're going to be the biggest threat to the escort carriers down the line. To the right there are the 6 escort carriers with their escorts, and they're already starting to lay smoke to hide the escort carriers from the approaching Japanese. So throughout the battle, and the battle lasts over 2 hours, throughout the battle, the escort carriers are the primary target of the Japanese. So the escort carriers are under heavy gunfire from battleships and cruisers for over 2 hours. And the Americans were successful in hiding the carriers for points in the battle with the smoke, and also at other points in the battle there were rain squalls. But there were other points during the battle when the Japanese were able to find their targets and engage them. They did succeed in hitting 4 of the escort carriers. One of these was hit badly and fell behind, and it was eventually sunk. This was the Gambier Bay. The Japanese had a very marked speed advantage, which they put to good advantage. And over the course of the battle, the Japanese cruisers did close to within 8,000 yards abeam the American escort carriers. So they were closing in late in the battle. But after over 2 hours of combat, Kurita decided to call off the attack. This is the first of his controversial decisions. Don't really know why he did this. He didn't talk about it extensively after the war. But there are several reasons why this probably occurred. The biggest one is poor communications. He had no idea where his forces were and what they were doing, how well they were doing. So he did not know that the heavy cruisers that were successful in finally closing their range and were getting very close to the American escort carriers. He also had fuel concerns once again. He had been under heavy air attack the whole day. Now he's fighting a fleet action. He has to hold a fuel reserve to maintain, to do his primary mission, which is get into Leyte Gulf. And he'd already been heavily damaged by the efforts of the American air attacks. He'd already lost 3 heavy cruisers during the day. So he decides to call off the battle, and the American escort carrier force, well handled by Sprague, survives the battle and inflicts heavy damage on the Japanese force. This slide here shows the position of the forces at about 0900, just before Kurita decided to call the battle off. The American carriers are there to the bottom left side of the slide. You can see them headed to the southwest. They're headed towards Leyte Gulf, which is where they'll find hope. They find help, they hope, from the 7th Fleet. You can see those 2 Japanese heavy cruisers there closing on them. But the rest of the Japanese force is well to the rear. Also, you can see in the slide the location of where Gambier Bay sunk. And there are also 3 American escorts that were sunk in the battle. The first was destroyer Hull, which you can see there in the middle of the slide. Destroyer Johnston was also sunk during the battle. And Samuel B. Roberts, an escort, destroyer escort, was also sunk in the battle as well. So after dealing the Americans heavy blows, Kurita decides to break off the battle. He thought he was fighting 3rd Fleet. He thought he had already sunk several carriers from 3rd Fleet. So this is a very successful battle in Kurita's view. But he has other things to do, so he breaks off the battle. And it takes him, though, 2 hours to get his force into some kind of formation once again. Again, they're dispersed. He has poor communications with them. So 2 hours later, he has the 1st Diversion Attack Force squared away again. And at this point, Leyte Gulf is only 45 miles away. So it appears like, against all the odds, he's on the verge of scoring a victory. He's going to get his force into Leyte Gulf and attack whatever is there. He informs his boss just after noon that he's headed into the Gulf. But then at about a half hour later, he changes his mind and he heads north. He changes course and he's now headed north away from Leyte Gulf. So he's given up the opportunity to score a Pyrrhic victory for the Imperial Navy. This is the most controversial decision of the battle from the Japanese side, without a doubt. And again, Kurita didn't explain himself after the war, so it's not clear exactly why he did this. But there are several reasons, I'm sure, that several factors going through his mind that factored into his decision. And the biggest one is that had he gone into the Gulf, he believed he would have been destroyed, trapped in the Gulf, and then destroyed by overwhelming forces. He had just fought part of the Third Fleet, he believed. There were other parts of the Third Fleet in the area, and there were more coming to the rescue of this American force he had just defeated. So in his view, if he went into the Gulf, he wouldn't get back out. And in fact, there really wasn't any part of the Japanese plan that dealt with what would happen after you get Kurita's force into the Gulf. How do you get it back out? And there's no doubt as well that he had doubts about the entire Show 1 plan. Because Kurita was no fool. He was a combat veteran. He knew how the Americans operated. He knew the strength of the Americans. He had seen it build throughout the war. In fact, a lot of officers in the 1st Diversion Attack Force had grave doubts about the Show 1 plan, and they expressed these openly on the 22nd of October before they left Brunei. But Kurita said, hey, we got to give it a shot. We have a possibility of achieving a decisive victory. And what man can say that he doesn't believe in miracles? But everybody knew that this plan was a long shot at best. So at the end of the day, Kurita made a very courageous decision. He did not take his force into Leyte Gulf because he did not want to simply sacrifice it for no gain. The Japanese didn't mind dying. Kurita wasn't a coward, but they want their deaths to account for something. And attacking empty transports was not a good use of the cream of the Japanese Navy. So Kurita heads north. He breaks off the attack into Leyte Gulf. In fact, he has an excuse to do so. There's an American carrier force reported to the north. It's not clear if this was a viable contact, but Kurita took it as an excuse to head north to attack a much more valuable target, a carrier force, and not empty transports in the Gulf. But there were no carriers there. It's a false contact. Kurita decides to continue north. He's now headed for the San Bernardino Strait, which he is able to transit unopposed once again later in the evening. Third Fleet under Halsey had gone to the north to chase the Japanese carrier force, which he succeeds in annihilating. He sinks all 4 Japanese carriers during the 25th. But he's under continual pressure to send some help down to the escort carriers in Kincaid's 7th Fleet. He doesn't do this until later in the afternoon, at which point he doesn't get to San Bernardino Strait in time to intercept Kurita. So Kurita escapes through San Bernardino Strait late on the 25th. The next day he comes under heavy air attack once again. Over 250 sorties against him on the 26th. Americans have some success sinking 1 light cruiser and 3 destroyers. So at the end of the battle, Kurita's force is heavily damaged, loses 10 ships, 3 more are heavily damaged. These forces return to Singapore. Most of them eventually get back to Japan, where very few see action again because of a fuel shortage. And that concludes the saga of Kurita's first diversion attack force. Okay, this last slide, we're going to wrap things up, talk about some overall takeaways in the battle, and we've already touched on some of these already. But the first one is the one I want to hammer home, and that is the Show One plan was utterly hopeless. It was a bad plan. And Toyota even admitted as such after the war. He knew we didn't have much of a chance for success, but I had to do something, and this is the best I could do. But it was a bad plan. So the only thing it achieved was it did sacrifice the bulk of the IJN, because after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy is really no longer an effective force. And the futility of the entire Show One plan can be shown by one fact. That is, on the 20th of October, the American invasion fleet was successful in getting the invasion force ashore, and then it left the area. The first reinforcement group showed up 2 days later on 22 October and did the same thing. It left the same day. The Americans were very adept at this point in the war in getting the invasion force ashore and then getting the invasion fleet out of harm's way. So within a few days, there were over 132,000 men on Leyte with 200,000 tons of supplies. So Kurita shows up 5 days later, and he cannot change the fact that the invasion has been successful. So the whole operation is futile. There is no way to stop the invasion. Another big takeaway is that Third Fleet, which was without a doubt the most powerful naval force in the world in October 1944, was not able to stop the movement of Kurita's force towards Leyte Gulf. And that's because Halsey handled the force badly, and it was never able to bring the bulk of its combat power against Kurita. The Battle off Samar, we talked about that in some detail. It was not a mythic victory against heavy odds. The Americans fought a good battle, well-handled force, and they were supported by heavy air attacks throughout the day. The Japanese, typically at this point in the war, did not fight well, and they did not use the advantages that they had. And no doubt the Americans fought a brave action. It was an epic victory, but it wasn't an epic victory against all the odds with no hope of success. Talk about Kurita once again. I think that he was exactly right. Had he gone into the Gulf, which he could have, he would never have gotten out of the Gulf. He would have had the rest of his force annihilated, and 15,000 men would have died for nothing. So he made the most rational decision of any Japanese naval commander during the battle. He decided to extract his force before it was totally annihilated, because there wasn't much in the Gulf to attack. Had he went into the Gulf on 25 October, there were a couple of dozen LSTs, a couple of dozen Liberty ships, and these were basically empty. So that's not going to turn the tide of war. It's not going to be a decisive victory. So when you hear accounts of the battle being a lost opportunity for the Japanese to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific, this is totally false. Even had Kurita got into Leyte Gulf, it would have had no effect. It probably wouldn't even have even been a delay in future American operations. So there was, like I said before, there was no prospects of Japanese victory at Leyte Gulf. What might have worked better for Toyota had he taken the time to think things through a little bit better. Instead of fighting for Leyte, he should have saved his forces, rebuilt his carrier force, tried to rebuild his land-based air forces, and fought this battle for the Philippines over Luzon and not at Leyte, because they would have been better prepared to do so several months later in October 1944. That's not to say that they would have had much greater success than they did at Leyte, but it would have been a tougher fight for the Americans later, a few months later. So that concludes our look today at the battles of the Sibuyan Sea and also the Battle off Samar. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.